lucky last afternoon here in La Paz, Bolivia, watching the thunderclouds roll in over the Andes before a 4 a.m. wake-up call for the flight back to Paraguay. Been here about a month, various expeditions and research trips, and I've just got back from the world-famous floating islands, the Uros Islands, which are actually in Peru, but Lake Titicaca shares a border, etc., etc. And I have to tell you, this was a fun one to end the expeditions on, because this was travel. I was in the area visiting other sites, and the reputation of visits to the Uros Islands amongst travel vloggers and travel bloggers is mixed at the moment. It's apparently too touristy. And I don't know what people who are blogging about travel in 2024 are expecting. Are they hoping to peel the beads back in this reed hut and be welcomed in with soup by a family and an elected chief? Like, what do these women think is going to happen to them? It's 2024. So it's always faintly bemusing when people say, oh, it's too touristy, that thing I got on a plane and crossed an ocean to come and see. But there's a bigger magical story or magical lesson even behind that. Because what occurred to me as I'm on this visit, and we ended up with a private tour which was great. So I got to ask very specific questions. It was just myself and my partner, because it was a Sunday and no one else was there, and so on. So we ended up with a private tour. So we went peak tourism on it. But what occurred to me is a line that has haunted me by, I think, maybe America's best living philosopher, one of them anyway, Orland Bishop. And he says, the answer will not be traditional because the world is no longer traditional. So the story of the Uros Islanders is they were being harassed by the Inca, the expansionist Inca, coming down into what we now call Bolivia and incorporating Lake Titicaca and rebuilding Tiwanaku and so on. They were sick of it. And they had what I find to be a very Futurama solution, which is they got in their boats, their reed boats, and just sailed like a couple of 100 feet offshore. That just seems very Futurama to me. Like, get it together, Inca. Like, they're right there. If you're interested in harassing them, taking their stuff. Anyway, so that's where the culture of living floating on Lake Titicaca came from. They doubled down on this when the Spanish arrived, and they sort of evolved from boats to the big floating platforms that they're on today. So already you have, well, the Uros Islanders aren't traditionally boat people anyway, and then they were on boats, and then they were on platforms. So to the hypothetical and complaining travel bloggers, what version of authenticity would you demand of the Uros when you encounter them and they touch your beautiful blonde hair and ask if you're from the stars or whatever the hell you think is going on there? This is an animist understanding of time, right? Like, the world, or the answer will not be traditional because the world is no longer traditional. And the principal complaint is you get on these boats. This is true, by the way. So go in eyes wide open. It's still worth it because I'm building to that point plainly. You get on your boat and you head out to the island, and there's a very tribal version of capitalism, which I find quite appealing. And it was even in Germany in the 12th century and later with various guilds and so on. There was a real struggle to get what we would consider to be free market economies to embed. And so there are divisions where one day the islanders in the north of the floating group get visited by the boats, and then another day it's the south that get visited on the boats, and they share the boats amongst those floating platforms for each one. So everyone, they don't all make the same money, right? But they have organized it so that they get access to an even spread as possible of tourists. You find that other places actually getting to Copacabana, you have to get on a little ferry with your car and take it over and so on. It's the same thing there, where they basically allocate different days to different ferry owners, so everyone gets their share. You might have a busy or a slow day, but everyone gets a day. So we went to ours, and it was a sort of smaller family group on this island. And the complaint, the blogging complaint, is that all they do is sell you souvenirs. Well, yeah. The lake is quite polluted. The way of life that, and this is coming back to what traditional answer, what's traditional Uros way of life? Is it floating platforms? Is it boats? Is it land? When they moved on to the boats and then the floating platforms made out of reeds, to avoid, you can with good reason call it economic change, like the arrival of the Inca and then the arrival of the Spanish. Well, that's happened again. That is happening now. This is a subsequent adaptation in order to keep living the way they want to live. And the cool thing is, the answer will not be traditional, but the Uros have provided a method of adaptation for themselves that allows them to retain a reasonable amount, I don't love the word traditional, but a reasonable amount of Urosness. Okay, so each little platform is a collection of different families, and they vote for a president. Can be male or female, quite recently. So I think only in the last 20 years you could vote for females, but whatever. Anyway, the president is the only person who's allowed to have a mobile phone on that platform. You had Signal there. I was texting in my Telegram group whilst on these islands, which is another one of those, like, the world, well, the answer will not be traditional because the world is not traditional moments. Like, I'm on a floating reed platform in the middle of Lake Titicaca, shitposting with the Rune Soup community. So, but the reason, because I asked this, I'm like, hang on, you just told me that women can be president, so some of the things that a modern sentiment may find distasteful about so-called traditional society has been shaved off here. Why? And apparently it's to be in accordance with the Inca rules of life, which is don't lie, don't steal, and don't be lazy. They believe, and you know what? Fair, that access to mobile phones will make you lazy. So not everyone gets one. So they still have a phone, so they still have access to modern material. They send their kids, at least for part of high school, to Puno, which is the Peruvian town on the shores of the lake that's closest to where the islands are. So there's a managed interaction with, I don't want to call it the outside world, but the non-Uros world. And really that's what they were doing the whole time. When you leave the shore and get onto the boats and go from the boats to the platforms, what you were doing is asserting sovereignty and healthy boundaries over how you wish to interact with the world. And it's on that level, and this is the key, this is like the pivot, this is the magical insight. It's on that level that they are still traditional. So the diet has changed somewhat because the lake's polluted, which means you have to adapt to the new economic situations, which is selling really nice, quite frankly, tapestries and so on to visiting Australians, so that you can get access to food that isn't polluted and so on. But you are, the continuity through all of this is healthy boundary work, right? Like it's a managed interaction with the non-Uros world. It's still hunting. They're still sharing the available resources to them on the lake. It's just that this time, that looks more like tourists arriving with opportunities to do sharing and trading and so on, so that money feeds back to continue to support the actual tradition, right? The actual tradition, which is maintaining sovereignty over, well, everything. I mean, it's pretty sovereign. They consider themselves Uros first and Bolivian or Peruvian second, Peruvian, realistically. And they are in the middle of a lake floating on their own houses. It's pretty sovereign, right? Like that's, when we go looking for continuities rather than change, rather than being disappointed that you aren't the first white woman or whatever they've ever seen who shows up and they're, I don't know, having traditional native dances that you've surprised them with. Like, what are you expecting? Ewoks? Like, I find travel blogging insufferable, especially when you are in fact witnessing a continuity, a magical continuity. When you go there, you're actually seeing the thing that the Uros do, which is adapt to changing circumstances in a way that they believe is best suited to them. That's the tradition. That's the thing. That's the animist way of thinking. So it was a fantastic trip, actually. It was really, really insightful to be able to see, because I'll be honest, I had low expectations based on some of the stuff you read about visiting the islands. I was expecting a tourist trap. I was expecting Main Street USA, because you hear all these stories that some of them, they don't even really live on the islands anymore. They just get out on boats early in the morning before the tourist boat shows up. Like, that's not correct. Like I saw their houses. I saw them playing football or soccer. It's amazing. There's a football pitch at the opening part of the main village. Like, they lived there. Certainly some of them still live in Puno, especially the kids who are going to school, right? And what surprised me and delighted me, not just when you have low expectations and thus they're easily exceeded, but that I did see a continuity. I did see a magical lesson. And watching these adaptations as continuity, it just brings up what I think is a powerful philosophical and metaphysical prescription for life, but for magic in particular, which is Orland Bishop. The answer will not be traditional because the world is no longer traditional. So let's bring that into the world of magic. We have a Grimoires course coming up at the time of recording this. We're probably in the middle of it if you're watching this when the video comes out. And if you're watching it afterwards, sign up below. It was amazing. All right. So in the 15 and 1600s, there was a very prescribed way, at least as far as we can tell, of doing grimoire magic. If the world is no longer traditional, what are the continuities? Right? What is the Uros continuity for grimoire magic? Is it, and I don't believe this to be the case, is it to be as precise with the ingredients, many of which are extinct or nearly extinct, the famous lion skin belt, of course, or is it something else? Like, what were they for? What is the true tradition? And how can we learn from the tension in that word expressed successfully elsewhere? How can we learn, and what does it mean for the practice of so-called Western magic to onboard? The answer will not be traditional because the world is no longer traditional. So that's what I'm sitting with. Maybe you've seen the lightning and heard the rain. That's what I'm sitting with on this last afternoon in the Andes. I have Orland Bishop's words in my head, and I have the inspiration, because it was the inspiration of how the Uros are living and thriving, I would even say. I'm going to leave you with that, where those words and that notion of what is actually traditional, which is best adaptation to the conditions that you have incarnated in. What does that look like for you? What does that look like for Western magic?